Balance of Terror, first broadcast 50 years ago in 1966, has long been seen as a classic episode of the original Star Trek. It involves a series of battles between the Enterprise and a Romulan bird of prey around the Neutral Zone, the restricted region of space separating the Federation and the Romulan Empire. The Neutral Zone evokes the Korean Demilitarized Zone, the Iron Curtain, and the 17th parallel separating North and South Vietnam, which was then a war zone. Both Captain Kirk, William Shatner, and the Romulan commander, Mark Leonard, know that their clash could ignite a devastating full-scale war, paralleling the threat of nuclear war at the time between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, on the bridge, Lieutenant Stiles, Paul Comey, questions the loyalty of Spock, Leonard Nimoy, because he looks like a Romulan. It's been little noticed that Balance of Terror is a quote from then Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara's description of the Cold War, with its potential for mutually assured destruction. Star Trek has sometimes been criticized as a near-utopia, but Balance of Terror has a militaristic edge and reveals that bigotry on the bridge is almost as much of a threat as the Romulans. President John F. Kennedy's handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 is a key event to start with in understanding the historical context of this episode. As was clear from the start of Star Trek, Captain Kirk was inspired in part by President Kennedy, and JFK's New Frontier was a template for Star Trek's Final Frontier. Star Trek was Cold War liberalism projected into the future, and arguably Kennedy's most important achievement was avoiding nuclear war after the Soviet Union installed scores of nuclear missiles in Cuba. As Kennedy said in a televised address on October 22, 1962, "This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites are now in preparation. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response." A nuclear holocaust seemed to threaten the world. The U.S. blockaded Cuba and demanded that the missiles be removed. Kennedy did not mention that the U.S. had nuclear missiles in Turkey at the time, about as close to the USSR as Cuba's were to the United States. Nevertheless, the secret installation of nuclear missiles in Cuba, after Soviet assurances to the contrary, was a destabilizing move that plunged the world into crisis. Behind the scenes, most of the U.S. military recommended to Kennedy a massive bombing of Cuba, followed by an invasion. JFK resisted the military's plans, fearing that an invasion could ignite a nuclear war, an end-of-civilization Twilight Zone scenario. As Kennedy's Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, said, "I walked out of the President's Oval Office, and I thought I might never live to see another Saturday night." He added that the whole world was in a, quote, balance of terror. Ultimately, the crisis was resolved because Kennedy offered to secretly remove our missiles in Turkey after the Soviets removed theirs from Cuba. Why was Kennedy effective at resolving this crisis? In part because he had recently read Barbara Tuchman's best-selling book about World War I, The Guns of August. The thesis of The Guns of August is that miscalculation and misunderstanding can lead to a devastating war that kills millions. Kennedy was so impressed with the book that he had his aides read it and ordered copies of The Guns of August distributed to every U.S. military base in the world. This book is possibly why we are all alive today. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a shock to the United States, and one that for some evoked the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. Balance of Terror was broadcast a week after the 25th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor, and there was a lot of media attention given to this anniversary, including a cover story in Newsweek. Balance of Terror similarly begins with a surprise attack on the Federation surveillance outposts that line the Neutral Zone. As Kirk is about to perform a wedding ceremony in the ship's chapel, Ensign Sulu, George Takei, interrupts with a shipwide announcement, "Alert, Captain to the bridge, all decks alert." On the bridge, Lieutenant Uhura, Nichelle Nichols, reports to Kirk that Outpost 4 is under attack. Kirk then asks Spock to show all decks this chart, showing the Neutral Zone and the Earth outposts, 3 of which have already been destroyed, as well as the position of the Enterprise as it moves in at maximum warp. Kirk announces to the ship that, in our next action, we can risk neither miscalculation nor error, and then turns the briefing over to Spock, who says, "Referring to the map on your screens, you will note beyond the moving position of our vessel a line of Earth outpost stations. Constructed on asteroids, they monitor the neutral zone established by treaty after the Earth-Romulan conflict a century ago. As you may recall from your histories, this conflict was fought with primitive atomic weapons." Spock adds that Earth believes the Romulans to be warlike, cruel, treacherous, and only the Romulans know what they think of Earth. Even the name Romulans evokes the Russians during the Cold War. But the name also, of course, references the Roman Empire, especially since the names of two of their key planets, Romulus, their capital, and Remus, come from the founding brothers of Rome. Kirk, like Kennedy, is a rational leader who seeks to prevent a larger war. But Styles recommends immediate attack. Kirk says, "After a whole century, what will a Romulan ship look like?" Styles replies, "You'll know, sir. They're painted like a giant bird of prey." Kirk, "I had no idea that history was your specialty." Styles, "Family history. There was a Captain Styles in the Space Service then, 2 commanders and several junior officers. All lost in that war, sir." Kirk, "Their war, Mr. Styles. Not yours. Don't forget it." It's then we learn from Spock that Outpost 3 has been, in Leonard Nimoy's memorably clear enunciation, pulverized. We then hear from Outpost 4, where Commander Hansen is the sole survivor of the latest Romulan attack, and he reports that after the attack, the whole vessel disappeared. Suddenly the bird of prey reappears and destroys the remains of Outpost 4, killing Hansen, before vanishing again with its cloaking device. The elegant Romulan ship was created by Chinese-American designer Hua Ming Chang. For the bird of prey emblem, he drew upon the symbol of the predatory eagle, used by the Roman Empire, Napoleon, and the Nazis. The Romulan cloaking device anticipates the stealth technology of Air Force bombers and fighters of a few decades later, but it also reaches back to the silent running mode of World War II submarines. Paul Schneider, the author of the Balance of Terror teleplay, was influenced by Run Silent, Run Deep, a 1958 submarine film starring Clark Gable. Gable plays a submarine captain who is Ahab-like in his obsessive quest to destroy a Japanese ship. This is similar to Kirk's relentless pursuit of the Romulan bird of prey. But unlike in many military movies, which feature leaders who seem to command almost solo, from Gable to Robert Mitchum in The Enemy Below, to Gene Hackman in the 1990s movie Crimson Tide, Kirk has a more group-oriented style of command in Balance of Terror. Like Kennedy with his executive committee, or XCOM, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kirk consults with his crew around a briefing table. This is a model of rational, knowledge-based decision-making, as opposed to a gut-based, shoot first and figure it out later approach. At the table, Spock holds a fragment of metal retrieved from the wreckage of Outpost 4 and says that this is the hardest substance known to our science, before crumbling it easily in his hand. After this demonstration, Kirk asks for analysis and recommendations. Spock says, obviously their weaponry is superior to ours, and they have a practical invisibility screen. Dr. Bones McCoy, DeForest Kelley, interrupts to say, "You're discussing tactics. Do you realize what this really comes down to? Millions and millions of lives hanging on what this vessel does." "Or on what this vessel fails to do, Doctor," interrupts Spock. Going around the table, Kirk learns from engineer Scotty, James Doohan, that the Enterprise has superior engines and is faster than the bird of prey. Styles again recommends immediate attack, but Sulu replies, "Attack? Without a visible target? How do we aim our phasers?" But Styles insists, "These are Romulans. You run away from them and you guarantee war." This is basically what Kennedy and other Cold Warriors said of the Soviets, the People's Republic of China, and their allies. Styles adds, "You know that, Mr. Science Officer. You're the expert on these people. But you've always left out that one point. Why?" Styles has questioned Spock's loyalty since they intercepted a Romulan message revealing that Romulans look like Vulcans. Stiles makes a snide comment about Spock's ability to break a coded Romulan message, and Kirk says, "I assume you are complimenting Spock on his ability to decode?" Stiles, "I'm not sure." Kirk then says, "Here's one thing you can be sure of, mister. Leave any bigotry in your quarters. There's no room for it on the bridge. Do I make myself clear?" This stand by Kirk against bigotry parallels the improved civil rights records of some liberals during the 1960s. Presidents Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, pressured by the civil rights movement and popular opinion, supported civil rights in part because it was the right thing to do, but also because America's entrenched and government-supported racism was accurately perceived by these presidents as damaging to America's image during the Cold War. Pictures and news films, for instance, of people being attacked by police, dogs, and fire hoses during peaceful civil rights protests in the 1960s shocked most Americans and much of the world. Over the years, some have understandably and rightly criticized the tokenism of Star Trek. But in 1966, the diversity found on the bridge, with Spock, Sulu, and Uhura, was at the time progressive. To put it in perspective, this 50-year-old episode has more diversity than the main cast of Friends from the 1990s, or Game of Thrones today. And yet, Kirk acknowledges that even with the progress that's been made in the 23rd century, that bigotry, like that of Stiles, may not be eliminated, only kept off the bridge. This is disturbing, but it's perhaps realistic that even in Star Trek's future, more work needs to be done to overcome prejudice. And ironically, at least from our perspective, back on the bridge, Sulu agrees with Stiles that added security steps should be taken in case there are Romulan spies on board the Enterprise. The irony is that after Pearl Harbor, hundreds of thousands of Japanese Americans were forcibly removed to concentration camps for years because of racist war hysteria, a grievous trampling on the U.S. Constitution. And George Takei, as a young boy, was, with his family, among those imprisoned in the camps. This blight on our history is one that the U.S. is still coming to terms with, and something that Takei has personally helped raise awareness about. The bottom line, however, is that Balance of Terror is critiquing this kind of racial suspicion of people during wartime. Back in the briefing room, Spock shocks everyone by agreeing with Stiles that they must respond immediately to the Romulan aggression, no matter what the cost. Spock recommends this based on his own Vulcan history, saying, "If the Romulans are an offshoot of my Vulcan blood, and I think this is likely, then attack becomes even more imperative." "War is never imperative," Bones interrupts, raising the tension between them in a way that became a hallmark of the series. "It is for them, Doctor," Spock says. "Vulcan, like Earth, had its aggressive colonizing period, savage even by Earth standards, and if the Romulans retain this martial philosophy, then weakness is something we dare not show." This existential concern about showing weakness was one of the backbones of the Cold War, and the main driver for the Vietnam War, which it was at the time of this episode nearing its peak. The core idea held by most in the U.S. national security establishment, including Robert McNamara, who, as mentioned, inadvertently gave this episode its title, was that Vietnam was like a domino piece, stacked up in a row next to all the other domino pieces of the various countries of Asia, so that if one fell to communism, the rest would all fall. 30 years after this episode was broadcast, McNamara published his memoirs, and even wept on national TV, for his crucial involvement in what he concluded, as he said in his title, in retrospect, was a war that was a colossal mistake, based on a misunderstanding of Vietnam, in part because of the fatally flawed domino theory. Even in 1966, Star Trek's references to the Cold War were seen by some. For instance, TV Guide highlighted this episode in that week's issue with a special close-up, stating in its short review that the warlike Romulans have sent a powerful flagship to probe Earth's defenses. Kirk knows that retreat will only invite further devastation. His alternative? Counterattack. Vietnam was the first real television war, and news programs like the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite, which brought the war into millions of American households, aired right before Star Trek 7:30 start time in major markets. As Mark Cushman writes, in 1966, quote, "The troops of North Vietnam continued to pour across the DMZ into the South, carrying out their military strikes, testing American defenses, and then retreating to the safety of home. The actions of the Romulans in Balance of Terror were clearly designed to mimic the tactics of the Viet Cong of this era." This episode of Star Trek, in other words, can be seen as a cultural part of the Cold War. It might even be seen, with its fetishized phasers, as providing support for the military-industrial complex that President Dwight D. Eisenhower warned the nation about in his farewell address in 1961. That's part of it, but Balance of Terror is more complicated than that. As the cat-and-mouse battles between the Enterprise and the Bird of Prey unfold, with both vessels being heavily damaged and the Enterprise almost destroyed by a Romulan nuclear weapon, we learn that the Romulan commander is a sympathetic character. We see the unnamed Romulan commander on his bridge, which, in homage to the submarine movies from which this episode borrows, looks like the bridge of a futuristic submarine, with viewing controls hanging from the center of the ceiling like a periscope. Like Kirk, the Romulan commander knows that the decisions he makes could mean death for millions if a larger war is triggered. As my colleague Megan McDonough pointed out to me, the moody lighting, including the strange pink hues for the Romulan commander and the shadowy key lighting for Kirk, shows that the weight of their decisions literally plays across their faces. The Romulan commander says to his second-in-command and friend, "No need to tell you what happens when we reach home with proof of the Earthmen's weakness, and we will have proof. The Earth commander will follow. He must. When he attacks, we will destroy him. Our gift to the homeland. Another war. Obedience, duty, death and more death. I find myself wishing for destruction before we can return." Meanwhile, on the Enterprise, Kirk takes a few minutes of downtime in his quarters, where he's visited by Bones. Kirk says, "I look around the bridge, and I see the men waiting for me to make the next move. And Bones, what if I'm wrong?" Kirk knows that Bones himself has been a critic of the pursuit of the Bird of Prey, and so he's making himself vulnerable, which reveals the depth of their friendship. Kirk says with evident fatigue, "I don't really expect an answer." The doctor says, "But I've got one, something I seldom say to a customer, Jim. In this galaxy, there's a mathematical probability of 3 million Earth-type planets, and in all the universe, 3 million galaxies like this. And in all of that, and perhaps more, only one of each of us. Don't destroy the one named Kirk." The sympathetic portrayal of both sides locked in this death struggle is almost as much of a critique of the Cold War as it is a reinforcement of it. And Bones, sounding almost like Carl Sagan, puts into this episode a cosmic and yet empathetic perspective on this Cold War in space. But the costs of war are made clear. All-out war is avoided, but with the loss of many lives. The Romulan commander says at the end, "You and I are of a kind. In a different reality, I could have called you friend." But conflicts of this kind don't have easy solutions, as we know today. Since 1947, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists has published a doomsday clock. In 1966, during the time this episode was aired, it was set at 5 minutes to midnight. And today, with much fluctuation of the minute hand in the intervening decades, the clock stands at 3 minutes to midnight. It is bittersweet to say that this episode is still relevant, because it means that we are still living in a balance of terror.